She was just a 19-year-old girl, sold into slavery at birth by a desperate family, branded with a seal on her wrist that condemned her to eternal servitude, malnourished and without the strength to fight. But when the vampire Lord Damien found that lost soul at the night auction, no one knew that that ancient heart would change everything in that life forever. The underground market breathes like a sleeping beast. Flickering torches lick the damp stone walls, creating shadows that dance like ghosts of past transactions. The sound of chains clangs in a hypnotic, cruel rhythm, mingling with the distant echoes of auctions that transform lives into numbers, bodies into merchandise. Through the narrow corridors, the smell of oxidized iron mingles with Centra's old mold and the dense, unmistakable odor of human despair, a perfume that clung to the stones like a promise that no soul leaves untouched. The torches, flames, crackle and pop, casting an orange light that reveals the hooded faces of shoppers, eyes sizing up meat like fruit at the market. On every corner, the muffled sound of sobs mingles with the shuffle of bare feet on the cold floor. And the air carries the weight of hundreds of stories cut in half, destinies cut short by hands that signed contracts with tears still fresh in their eyes. Isadora balances on the worn wooden platform like a wilted flower trying to stay afloat against the storm. Her burlap dress, torn at the edges and stained with dried mud, barely covers her skeletal body, which shivers not only from the cold, but from a hunger that has learned to dwell in her bones. Her bare feet, cut by stones and shards, bleed discreetly on the boards, creating small puddles that no one bothers to clean. Her brown hair, once perhaps shiny, now hangs disheveled around her pale face, framing eyes that have learned to expect no mercy. On her left wrist, a brand burned with an iron, a circular seal with ancient symbols, tells the story she chose not to live. The skin around the scar still has purplish hues, a sign that the branding was inflicted recently, when her last owner decided she was no longer worth the daily ration. At 19, Isadora carries within her the universal language of slavery: hunched shoulders that have learned not to take up space, hands that move slowly so as not to arouse anger, and a gaze that sweeps the ground for crumbs of humanity someone might have dropped. The auctioneer shouts numbers that rise like steps to a gallows, and she remains still, knowing that any movement could be interpreted as resistance, and resistance is priceless in places where hope is contraband. When a gust of cold wind sweeps through the underground market, she hugs her arms to her body, not for warmth, but to make herself smaller, almost invisible, in the vain hope that the night will end without anyone deeming her worthy of possession. The memory returns in sharp fragments, like shards of glass that refuse to form a complete image. The shack where she lived for the first 5 years. Wooden walls that let the cold in through cracks that felt like open wounds. Her father, a man with calloused hands and eyes that avoided hers, counted out insufficient coins on the table while hooded men waited at the door. "Father, we have no choice. The debt must be paid. She was born for this." The words fall like stones into the empty stomach of memory. And the mother who once hummed lullabies and kissed wounds, now weeps tears that cannot wash away the decision already made. Mother, voice broken, but resigned. "Forgive us, my daughter. Perhaps you will find a kind man who understands that you are more than a number." But the hooded men were already advancing, and Isadora's small hands clung to her mother's dirty apron until stronger fingers tore her away, carrying her away from the only home she had ever known. That day, she learned that love has limits, that hunger can make parents choose between children and bread, and that some goodbyes are irreversible. Only the empty promise of a future that maybe, just maybe, will be less cruel than the present that drove her away. The voices of the past rise like specters of memory, each word a sharp blade that cuts deeper than any whip, sold at birth, whisper the echoes of the market. A blood debt passed down from generation to generation, a curse from the cradle that cannot be broken. The terms repeat themselves like a cruel mantra, a liturgy of despair that turns children into bargaining chips and families into auctioneers of their own flesh. The auctioneers, men with faces lined with greed and hearts hardened by profit, exchange phrases that fall like sentences. One without a name begets another without rights. they say, laughing through yellowed teeth. Bastard of a bastard, what can you expect other than a few more coins? The cruelty in their words is not accidental, it is calculated, designed to shatter any shred of dignity that might still leap in the chest of those listening. Isadora, summoning the last shreds of courage still inhabiting her exhausted body, begs for shelter and work, offering her calloused hands and the promise of silent obedience in exchange for a roof over her head and a plate of food a day. The laughter she receives in response echoes through the stone vaults like hyenas fighting over carrion, and the threat of a new auction hangs in the air like a storm cloud, ready to descend upon her head. Outside, the torrential rain pounds against the stones with the fury of 1,000 hammers, and each drop that hits the ground sounds like the imaginary hammer of the auctioneer reverberating in the thunder. The storm becomes a living metaphor for the despair that consumes the hearts of those who have learned that life can be weighed, measured, and sold by hands that have never known hunger. Damien, a vampire lord with a stern presence and hypnotic golden eyes, watched from the darkness with the patience of one who had accumulated centuries of experience. His predatory nature, honed by decades of hunting and survival, recognized something unique in that marked pulse. Not just the acrid smell of fear, or the metallic temps of young blood, but the unmistakable ancient signature of a plundered house, a lineage he thought lost forever. In his 800 years of existence, he had seen empires rise and fall, witnessed the rise and fall of entire dynasties. But the symbol engraved on that young woman's wrist awakened in him a memory he thought he had buried with his own family. He knew, with the certainty that only age and pain can bring, that within that fragile creature lived not just a broken soul, there pulsed a coat of arms trying to breathe again, a name that refused to die, even after being forcibly ripped from his family tree. Isadora's body finally succumbs to the accumulated exhaustion of weeks without adequate food and sleepless nights, collapsing onto the uneven cobblestones with the melancholy grace of a discarded rag doll. Her small bundle of belongings bursts open upon impact, scattering the few rags she possesses and revealing a cheap medallion of tarnished metal, crude piece engraved with an incomplete symbol by inexperienced hands, half a coat of arms that tells an interrupted story. Damien emerges from the shadows with the deathly silence of one who has learned to walk among the living unnoticed, approaching the fallen figure with measured steps. When he lifts it from the ground, he does so with the solemnity of someone collecting a fallen standard on the battlefield, not in haste or desperation, but with the respect due to something that was once sacred and can be again. Isadora awakens in an environment that defies her life experience. Dry sheets that smell of lavender rather than mildew. Noble coats of arms covered in velvet cloths, as if history itself had learned modesty. And a fireplace whose flames dance with the vivacity of someone who has never known cold or hunger. The contrast with the underground market is so stark that, for a moment, she wonders if she has died and awakened in some kind of elaborate purgatory. Their first conversation is a minefield of mutual distrust. She, taught by life that all protection has a price and all kindness hides a trap, fears she's merely exchanging iron chains for silken shackles. He, aware of the weight of centuries and the broken promises he's accumulated, insists with the patience of someone with eternity ahead of him that a true vow isn't about possession. It's the art of protecting without possessing, of caring without controlling, of offering shelter without building a prison. The Gothic mansion rises against the night sky like a stone titan defying time, its pointed towers piercing the low clouds like ancient fingers reaching for the stars. Each brick tells a story the city's dangerous streets could never whisper. Here, architecture serves not only to shelter, but to proclaim lineages, preserve memories, and guard secrets that have spanned centuries without losing their thread. The stained glass windows of the tall windows filter the moonlight in colorful fragments, revealing coats of arms where half the symbols have been deliberately erased, glass scars that betray a house that survived betrayals, but chose to hide its wounds until the time came to reveal them again. The rules of protection are established with the precision of a military ritual. Nighttime perimeters demarcated not by walls but by an energy that makes intruders deviate without understanding why. Forbidden towers that guard secrets so ancient that their keys were forged in times when the very word forbidden meant something different. Names that cannot be spoken until the ritual of recognition is completed. As if certain words had the power to awaken ghosts best left sleeping. The vampire housekeeper who runs the house is a creature of fascinating contrasts, pragmatic as a surgeon, maternal as a centuries-old wet nurse, and possessing a knowledge of medicines that the city forgot when it decided to trade ancient wisdom for modern convenience. Her footsteps echo through the hallways with the rhythm of someone who knows every stone of the building, every secret of the rooms, and every recipe that can heal both wounds of the body and scars of the soul. The room prepared especially for the expectant mother is a sanctuary of anticipatory care. Dense blankets woven with threads carrying protections whispered in dead languages. Protective talismans hung in strategic locations that form an invisible constellation of security. And a crib covered in silk, veils still empty, but promised. As if hope itself had learned to take physical form and materialized in hand-carved wood. Adapting to a sheltered yet isolated life is a process that occurs in the body before reaching the mind. Muscles that have been tense due to the constant expectation of danger gradually begin to relax. The nervous system, programmed to interpret every sound as a potential threat, must relearn the difference between a wind rattling against the window and footsteps approaching with hostile intentions. The body unlearns the language of fear, like someone unlearning a foreign language slowly, with resistance, finding each new word of peace unfamiliar to it that it must incorporate into its emotional vocabulary. Her concerns about the pregnancy and the future manifest themselves in a private ritual. She writes letters to the baby still growing in her womb, pages where she pours out fears and promises in equal measure. "I promise that your first cry will not be a commodity," she writes in shaky handwriting, "that your tears will never be catalogued as a sign of weakness, and that the first word you hear will be your name, not a price." The letters accumulate in a special drawer, paper treasures that hold oaths made in the silence of those who have learned that certain promises are too sacred to be spoken aloud. The protective vampire's constant coldness stems not from indifference, but from the iron discipline of centuries of experience. It is the meticulous posture of someone who has learned to keep the night away from the window, who knows the dangers lurking at gates, and who knows that ill-measured kindness can open breaches that cost lives. Every measured gesture, every weighted word, every calculated silence is part of a protective choreography he has perfected over decades, defending what he considers sacred. Small supernatural medical treatments become part of the routine. Infusions prepared with herbs that grow only under the light of a full moon. Ointments that soothe not only physical pain, but also the memories of shackles that still make the pulse throb. Compresses that carry whispered incantations in languages that predate the founding of the city itself. And aromatic baths that wash not only the body, but also the echoes of humiliation that have clung to the skin like unwanted perfume. Vampire. This is how it is. If you want your child to survive, you have to trust that I know how to protect what is mine. The phrase hangs in the air like a sharp blade, cutting through the silence with the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Protagonist. I'm not your property. The answer is charged with a dignity that slavery could not completely break, a spark of resistance that ignites even in the hearts of those who have learned to lower their heads. Vampire. No. But the seal on your wrist says they stole your name. I'm here to give it back, if you choose. And in this exchange of words, something fundamental changes in the atmosphere of the room. Protection stops being imposed and becomes a choice. Security stops being a prison and becomes an invitation. And the future, for the first time in years, stops being something that happens to her and becomes something she can help build. Morning breaks over the mansion like a whispered promise. But for Isadora, it brings with it a wave of nausea that doubles her over the porcelain basin. Her fingers grip the cold edges as her stomach rebels against the very idea of food, and the world spins in spirals that make her legs tremble. That's when Damien appears at her side, not in a rush or alarm, but with the steady presence of someone who has learned that certain pains must be witnessed in silence before they can be healed. His cold hands first find her feverish forehead. then moved down to gently cover the seal marked on her wrist, not to hide it, but as if to create a barrier between the scar and the memory it carries. The contrast in temperature is immediate, where her skin burns with the discomfort of pregnancy. His fingers bring a relief that seems to come from centuries of knowledge about how to soothe pains that transcend the merely physical. The vampire prepares ancient medicines with the precision of an alchemist. Dried leaves that exude the aromas of forgotten forests, ground roots that carry the wisdom of lands no longer on maps, and a mixture that bubbles gently as he whispers words in a language that predates the founding of the first cities. Every movement is ritual, every gesture a silent prayer addressed not to the heavens, but to the depths of ancestral memory. Then he teaches an ancient mantra to soothe a scarred heart, syllables that intertwine like lovers' fingers, words that create a hypnotic rhythm capable of synchronizing one's breathing with something greater than the pain itself. "Breathe with me," he says, and for the first time in years, Isadora allows someone else to dictate the rhythm of her lungs. The first conversation about the baby's nature takes place in this moment of shared vulnerability. He speaks with the authority of one who has borne the burden of protecting lineages for centuries. This child is not merchandise nor bargaining chip. It is the heir of a vow that transcends debts, the bearer of a name that was stolen but not destroyed. The words fall like balm on wounds she didn't even know she had, reshaping the future of the child growing in her womb. Their physical approach is as careful as handling ancient crystal. He asks permission before each touch, waits for the response in her eyes before allowing his fingers to find her skin, and immediately withdraws when he senses any sign of discomfort. It's a dance of consent that transforms each gesture into a choice, each caress into a conscious decision. "This is how you manage pain," he said, placing his icy hands on her feverish forehead with the reverence of someone touching a sacred relic. "Let the energy flow through you. Don't fight the past manifesting in the present. This isn't just an ordinary pregnancy, it's the restitution of an ancient birthright. The awakening of a lineage that refused to die even when they tried to bury it with contracts and chains." The confession comes shrouded in the late afternoon gloom, when the shadows lengthen, creating a natural confessional between them. Damien reveals the burden he's carried for centuries. He lost his family when conspirators discovered that the blood of newborns in his lineage could break ancient curses, and so they began selling them as ingredients for forbidden rituals. Vows torn like ordinary paper, coats of arms split in half so no one could reconstruct the full story, cribs that dawned empty as the children were carried to markets that operated in the shadows of cathedrals. The explanation of why the child is important follows naturally. It's not about crowning his power or adding another piece to his personal heritage, but about giving back a name to someone born without one. About reclaiming an identity that was stolen even before the first cry. "Your daughter will not be my heir," he clarifies. "She will be the heir herself to a house that will learn to breathe again, to a coat of arms that will once again mean protection instead of persecution, to a future where no child will have to carry on their wrists the price others have placed on their head." And when night finally settles over the mansion, something fundamental has shifted between them. Protection has gone from being an imposition to a collaboration. Care has gone from being one-sided to a mutual exchange, and the future, for the first time, has begun to feel like a place they both could choose to be. One afternoon, Isadora decides to prepare a meal that awakens dormant memories. She cooks as she did in the hard times of the poor market, with simple ingredients that she transforms into complex flavors through the art of necessity. Onions browned in olive oil until caramelized. Seasonings that cost pennies but were worth fortunes to those who know hunger. And the slow ritual of someone who learned that cooking is an act of love, even when there isn't enough love around. The aroma spreads through the mansion's corridors like a benevolent ghost, carrying with it the essence of simpler, more honest homes. Damien pauses in the hallway as if struck by a bolt of nostalgia. The scent transports him back centuries, when his own home knew the clang of pots and pans, laughter in the kitchen, and meals shared around tables that didn't need to be grand to be sacred. It had been decades since he'd felt the mansion breathe like this, like a home. not just a fortress. Surprised by the care he's received, he allows her to choose the songs that rock the nights, not the classical compositions that have echoed for centuries off the Gothic walls, but simple melodies she knows by heart, human songs that speak of small hopes and imperfect loves. Mutual gratitude arises organically, without contracts or expectations. Just the silent recognition that each is offering the other something they didn't know was missing. The most touching moment comes when he feels the baby move for the first time. She takes his cold hand and places it on her rounded belly. And when the tiny kick happens, Damien closes his eyes as if listening to an ancient hymn for the first time in centuries. It's a moment of absolute surrender, where the centuries-old vampire becomes simply a man touched by the miracle of life pulsing beneath his fingers. Nighttime strolls through the garden become a ritual. Among rose bushes that bloom only under moonlight and stone paths polished by time, they walk in comfortable silence. Isadora gazes at the starry sky and names constellations she invented without an atlas: the waiting mother, the silent protector, the house that does not abandon, creating her own mythology that reshapes the firmament, according to the hope she has learned to nurture. The accidental contact during prenatal care evolves into anchoring points: a finger that slips while taking a pulse, a hand that lingers while checking a temperature, shoulders that brush when sharing a book about ancestral lineages. Respect measures every distance. He never advances without invitation. She never retreats without reason. And between them grows a physical language based on consent and mutual desire. The romantic tension intensifies with the ever-present protective element. When he sings ancient songs, he directs his voice not to her, but to the child growing in her womb. They are melodies in forgotten languages that sound like oaths in musical form, sung promises that reach the baby through the mother's skin and bones. Isadora closes her eyes and feels the vibrations of the ancient words coursing through her body like a blessing. Vampire, don't fool yourself, okay? I'm still a cursed creature. I'm not a family man. The statement is laden with the weight of centuries, with a keen awareness of his own nature and the limitations it imposes. He looks at his own hands as if they were foreign, remembering all they've done, all the blood they've spilled. Protagonist, I know. But sometimes even the darkest souls can be the protection a life needs. Her response doesn't deny the darkness within him, but rather recontextualizes it. It's not an attempt to change or save him, but rather an acknowledgement that true protection sometimes comes from unlikely places, from creatures who know the darkness intimately and therefore know how to keep the light safe. In the silence that follows, something fundamental shifts between them. The conversation doesn't resolve their differences, but it does honestly name them. He remains a vampire, she remains human, but they find common ground in their decision to protect the life she carries, not as a traditional family, but as allies united by a vow that transcends conventional definitions of love, care, and responsibility. And as night closes in on the garden, they walk back to the mansion not as lord and ward, but as two people who have chosen to share the burden of the future, each carrying their own darkness, but together creating enough light for new life to grow safely. The mansion's ancient library transforms into an intimate sanctuary under the silvery light of the full moon that pours through the centuries-old stained glass windows, creating a mosaic of colors that dances across the shelves laden with ancient knowledge. In the center of the room, on a black marble table, rests a broken coat of arms, half of a symbol that tells a story, interrupted next to a book of ancestral vows, whose yellowed pages record oaths, sworn in times when words were weighted with blood and honor was worth more than life. The fireplace crackles with flames that seem to whisper ancient secrets, casting dancing shadows that lend the library an intimate and welcoming atmosphere, as if time itself has learned to be gentle within those walls. Isadora, late in her pregnancy, stands firm despite the tremor that occasionally runs through her body, not from fear, but from the proximity of a moment she knows to be definitive, a turning point where past and future meet to negotiate the terms of existence. Vampire. I lost my family 800 years ago when they discovered that the blood of newborns in our lineage could break ancient curses. The thirst that followed turned into impenetrable armor. Loneliness became a defense mechanism that kept me alive, but dead inside. But you arrived carrying a birth kidnapped by fate, and gave me something I had forgotten how to find. A reason to return names instead of imposing chains, to protect instead of possess, to build instead of just surviving. The words come out of him like a confession of a sin he's carried alone for too many centuries. Each syllable weighing like molten lead, but also bringing the relief of finally finding someone willing to hear truths never meant to be kept secret. The moonlight seems to intensify as he speaks, as if even the stars recognize the significance of that moment of absolute vulnerability. Vampire, I no longer know how to protect without possessing. Centuries of solitude have taught me to see care as control, love as ownership. I fear suffocating you with the intensity of a protection that has learned no limits. The confession is charged with a humanity that immortality has not been able to completely erase, revealing the internal conflict of a creature who ardently desires to care, but does not know how to do so without destroying what he intends to protect. Protagonist, so promised to protect by choosing and, let me choose, to. True protection happens not over someone, but with someone. Teach me your fears, and I'll teach you mine. We build an agreement where we're both guardians, not owners. Her response offers no easy solutions, but proposes a partnership based on mutual consent and shared responsibility, redefining protection as collaboration rather than imposition. The promise of eternal protection for mother and child is recorded in the ancient book not as a pact of possession, but as a covenant of guardianship, each word chosen with surgical precision, each phrase constructed to create rights rather than obligations, freedoms rather than chains. The ink used is a blend of ancient elements that glows softly when it touches the parchment, as if magic itself recognizes the purity of intention. Blood oaths follow an ancient ritual, but adapted to the needs of the present. It offers three distinct paths, reclaiming the ancestral coat of arms with its history of glory and tragedy, forging a new coat of arms that tells only the stories they choose to write, or going without a coat of arms at all, creating an identity that transcends traditional heraldry. The name will be yours, he declares, and with the name, the right to decide what story it tells. The culminating moment comes when the broken coat of arms finally receives its missing piece, not an extension of his house, but a completely new symbol inscribed by it, designed with characters that blend ancestral elegance with the personal strength of those who survived abandonment and chose to flourish. When the two halves fit together, the click is not merely mechanical, it is the sound of a lineage learning to breathe again, of a future finally allowed to exist. And in the light of the full moon that witnesses everything through the stained glass windows, two people who carried broken stories discover that together they can create whole, complete and truly free narratives. 3 years passed, and their lives changed forever. Between nights of watchful protection and days of devoted care, they built a family that grew under the silvery light of the moon, where vows sustain bridges connecting past and future, and names protect cradles like ancestral talismans, woven of hope and determination. The Gothic mansion now breathes with a different rhythm. The hallways that once echoed only with solitary footsteps now carry the sound of small feet running over centuries-old carpets, children's voices that discover echoes and transform them into games, and the constant music of a house that has learned to be a home. The child's birth took place on a moonless night, surrounded by protective rituals that Damien adapted from ancient traditions, songs whispered in ancient languages, candles arranged in geometric patterns that create invisible shields, and the constant presence of the vampire housekeeper who knows obstetric secrets that modern medicine has forgotten. The girl was born with subtle gifts that manifests as a special attunement to the world around her. She recognizes danger by sound, turning her head when hostile footsteps approach the property, and she smiles at the moon as if recognizing an old friend, stretching chubby little arms toward the window whenever the silvery light bathes her crib. The vampiric adoption ritual described in the ancient scrolls was adapted to create bonds of protection, not transformation, a ceremony in which 3 drops of Damien's blood were mixed with sacred soil from the estate, and water from a spring that has run for centuries beneath the mansion. The child belongs to the house's circle by conscious choice of the parents, protected by ancient magic while preserving their human nature, creating a unique bridge between two worlds that rarely find themselves in harmony. The awakening of the lineage manifests itself in documentary and social changes. Centuries-old records are rewritten with ink that glows under moonlight. Coats of arms are restored in registry offices that function for both the human and supernatural worlds, and public archives begin returning erased surnames to families who thought they had lost their identity forever. The protection network created by Damien expands, sheltering others who bear birth seals, and offering not only protection but also the restitution of rights that were stolen along with their names. The non-traditional family thrives in ways that defy convention, yet embrace humanity. The mansion's hallways echo with children's laughter, mingling with adult conversations about ancient philosophy and modern cuisine. Centuries-old halls host music ranging from classical symphonies to made-up lullabies, and the estate's doors remain open to others who carry similar seals on their wrists, a sanctuary where the reclamation of identity happens one person at a time. The auction network that for decades traded in human lives is systematically exposed and dismantled through a combination of supernatural investigation and coordinated legal action. The old auction floor, where so many fates were decided by hammer blows, is transformed into a trade school where young people learn professions that guarantee them economic independence and dignity, a symbolic transformation that converts the space of exploitation into a territory of empowerment. Those who profited from sold cradles and destroyed families try to negotiate their way out of the consequences, offering bribes and political favors, but find answers written in human law and sealed by ancestral vows that do not recognize money as a currency of forgiveness. Justice comes both through the courts and through supernatural pressures that make the lives of these exploiters progressively more uncomfortable, until they choose to leave the city in search of territories less protected by ancient guardians. The cycle of abandonment is definitively broken within a 100-kilometer radius of the mansion. No birth is treated as a commodity where ancestral oaths stand vigil. Other vampire houses, inspired by Damien's example, begin to adopt similar protocols, creating a network of protection that quietly spreads through towns where children once disappeared without a trace. In that mansion, where silence once weighed like a death sentence, now echoed the laughter of children running through the corridors and songs that taught forgotten names to the memory of the centuries-old walls. The family that seemed impossible arose from the careful restitution of stolen rights and the patience of those who understand that some oaths transcend generations, proving that the oldest power of a true vow is its ability to transform chains that bind into paths that liberate, scars that shame into coats of arms that pride, and pasts that destroy into futures that build bridges between worlds that have finally learned to complete each other.